Hello and welcome to the Cornell Center for Historical Keyboards. I'm Roger Moseley, Associate Professor of Music at Cornell University, and I'm here with the Center's Artist-in-Residence, Dr. Mike Cheng-Yu Lee, with Dr. Ji-Yun Kim, lecturer in the Department of Music at Cornell and specialist in music emanating from the Schumann-Brahms circle, and special guest Dr. Jacquelyn Sholes, visiting Assistant Professor of Music at the University of Rochester. And we're here as part of the Center's series, Future Imperfect, Brahms and the Passage of Time, which addresses the shifting relationship between Johannes Brahms' writing for the piano over the course of his career and the different instruments on which his music was played and heard. This series will continue into fall 2021 and will feature performances and presentations by Malcolm Bilson and Theodora Shebenescu-Martin, as well as Mike and Ji-Yun. This past semester, we focused on a work that affords a unique insight into Brahms' changing perspectives on both composition and performance, his piano trio in B, Opus 8, which he initially wrote as a 20-year-old and then thoroughly revised some 35 years later. We've posted recent recordings made of both versions using pianos in the Center's collection. The early version, performed by violinist Rebecca Anderson, cellist John Haynes-Eitzen, and me, features an 1857 JB Stryker piano, this one right in front of me, generously donated to the Center by Alan Bostrom, while the later version, performed by violinist Miriam Fried, cellist Clancy Newman, and pianist Miriam Polsky, features a 1908 Steinway Model D. Broadly speaking, both these pianos would have been familiar to Brahms. He kept an 1868 Stryker piano in his Viennese apartment, and he recommended American Steinways for performances of his concertos. But in the long run, the type of piano he was most familiar with was a Graf, not so dissimilar from those played by Beethoven. Brahms grew up playing such pianos, and upon Robert Schumann's death in 1856, his widow Clara gave Brahms his Graf, which Brahms kept until he acquired the Stryker. So here at the center, we have three related instruments closely related to Graf pianos, which will feature in future events in our Brahms series. But for now, I just wanted to stress that there is no single Brahms piano. Throughout his career, Brahms conceived new music at old instruments, and he played old music on newer instruments. And that's why we called this series Future Imperfect. It conveys the notion that the past can extend into the future, while the future itself depends on the past. So for us, the process of reimagining Brahms's music is never complete. And this is why the trio in B is such an intriguing case study, especially since the heavily revised version is so much better known than the early version. The original version is inflected by our knowledge of what was later added and removed, while the later version still bears the traces of Brahms's youth refracted through his later experiences. But although we cannot help but perceive the early version through the lens of Brahms's revisions, playing it on the Stryker and on earlier pianos gives us the opportunity to hear it afresh. So we're delighted to have Dr. Jacquelyn Sholes join us today because, among many other things, she specializes in narrative, illusion, and meaning in 19th century music. And her book, Illusion as Narrative Premise in Brahms's Instrumental Music, was published by Indiana University Press in 2018. And it contains a flagship chapter on the Opus 8 trio. So we're going to start by asking Jacquelyn to give her an overview of her research into the piece and what each of the two versions can tell us about Brahms's compositional practice in the 1850s and the 1880s. So over to you, Jacquelyn.
Thank you very much, Roger. And I just want to say that I am delighted to be here discussing this work with all of you. So thank you so much for inviting me. My work on the B major trio was first published in an article in 19th Century Music, and the material in that article also served as the basis for the chapter in my book, as Roger mentioned. So you asked me to speak a little bit about my book by way of introduction. So the book is called Illusion as Narrative Premise in Brahms's Instrumental Music. That's Illusion with an A. And it was published in 2018 by Indiana University Press. And this project grew out of my dissertation research, which involved examining the role of the finale in Brahms's early multi-movement instrumental works, particularly works of the 1850s, including the piano sonatas, the B major trio, the first serenade, and the first piano concerto. So I was spending a lot of time looking at intermovement relationships and narratives, including motivic, harmonic, and structural relationships and their evolution across movements of a single work. And what really intrigued me was that I found that in most of the works I was looking at, some of the most interesting intermovement relationships had to do with motives that had long been recognized and accepted as allusions to the music of other composers. Beethoven, Haydn, Schubert, among others. So the picture that was emerging was that the music of earlier composers was playing a really important role in Brahms's conception of large-scale motivic structure across movements of his works in the 1850s. And when I speak of allusion, by the way, I'm referring, just to be clear, to an instance in which Brahms is borrowing material from a pre-existing musical source. Generally, it's melodic material, sharing with its source an exact or reasonably close sequence of pitches and usually rhythms, and there are often harmonic or textural parallels as well. I also write about examples where there are more large-scale structural parallels, as in the finale of Brahms's first piano concerto, where whose structure was based on that of the final movement of Beethoven's third piano concerto. So by way of context, in the 1850s, Brahms was a young man in his 20s, just getting his career off the ground and very concerned with situating himself historically with respect to his predecessors, trying to navigate a middle ground between acknowledging and building on the musical legacy of his forebears. He was, as we know, a very historically minded composer with a fascination for music of the past. He took an active interest in collecting, studying, and editing historical repertory. And this comes through in his music through generic, stylistic, and motivic allusions to music of the past. Ironically, Brahms's historical concerns of this sort were actually in some ways rather modern for his time, because this was a period in which such things as the field of music history, an interest in historical repertory, and the notion of a musical canon were very much under development. But with all of this naturally came a great concern in Brahms for how his music would both draw on and distinguish itself from his musical lineage. So what emerged for me, the more I looked at his early multi-movement works, was the way he seemed to be using music of his predecessors so as to position himself and his own music relative to theirs. So that's really the main argument of my book, that he's using these allusions in a way that often pertains not only to localized passages, but to the large-scale cross-movement structures of the music, and that this has something to do with how he's positioning himself and his music relative to his predecessors and their music. So turning to the Opus 8 trio, our main focus for today, I'll start with a little bit of basic information and historical context. As we know, there are two versions of the piece. The original composed in January 1854, a few months before Brahms turned 21, and a version revised in 1889 when Brahms was 56, that was published in 1891. His publisher, Simrock, had purchased the rights from the original publisher, Breitkopf and Herdel, and was preparing to republish the work and asked Brahms if he wished to revise the piece prior to its republication. It's the revised version of the piece that is now most often performed and is considered the definitive version of the piece. But for 35 years, the first version was the only one that existed and circulated. The most substantive differences between the two versions are the replacement of the second theme groups in the first, third, and fourth movements with new material, new themes. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. We're going to be focusing today, I believe, primarily on the 1854 version, as it's roughly contemporary with the center's newly acquired 1857 Streicher. But this trio was Brahms's first published chamber work. Up to this time, he had been writing mainly solo piano works and songs. A few months before, he had introduced himself to Robert and Clara Schumann and had been enthusiastically taken under their wing, resulting in the publication in October 1853 of Robert Schumann's article Neue Bahnen, New Paths, in which Schumann touted Brahms as essentially a musical messiah of sorts, helping to foster the notion of Brahms as an heir to the likes of Beethoven, something that, of course, placed tremendous pressure on the young Brahms when it came to positioning himself historically. Then in February 1854, just the month following the completion of the trio, Schumann leapt into the Rhine River in a state of mental collapse and was committed to the asylum where he would spend the remaining 2 years of his life. And Brahms rushed back to the Schumann's Dusseldorf home to help Clara care for her household and her family, which included 6 surviving children and a 7th on the way. My own work on the 1854 version of the trio has focused mainly on identifying a previously unrecognized thematic allusion to a pre-existing work and examining how that allusion seems to function within the piece, both in terms of internal motivic relationships across movements of the trio, thereby informing the large-scale musical structure and narrative of the work, and also how this allusion resonates with other long recognized allusions in the piece, and what that might tell us about any possible meanings behind the allusions and also behind Brahms's later revisions to the work. I'll start with the 2 previously recognized allusions, both of which have been widely acknowledged since the 19th century. So I'm just going to share my screen here for a moment. So just, this is a picture of Brahms in 1853, roughly contemporary with the composition of this work. So the first allusion occurs in the second theme of the trio's 3rd movement, the slow movement, and it's a reference to the song Am Meer from Schubert's song cycle Schwanengesang. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read the whole text, but it is in short a recollection of the narrator's parting from his tearful beloved. The second allusion, and let me just show you, this is a comparison of the 2 passages, the original Schubert song on the top and the beginning of the second theme of the 3rd movement in the Brahms trio on the bottom. The second allusion appears in the second theme of the trio's 4th movement and refers to the final song of Beethoven's An die ferne Geliebte, in which the narrator requests that his beloved sing back to him the earlier songs of the cycle as a way of bridging the distance between the 2 lovers. And Brahms, this is the comparison of the 2 passages here, the Beethoven on the top, and then the passage in the Brahms. And then on the bottom, you'll see a passage from Robert Schumann, because Brahms may have borrowed this tune by way of Schumann, as a similar variant of it appears, as we can see here, in Schumann's C major Fantasy, where according to Schumann, it served as a message to his own beloved, Clara Wieck, in the years before his marriage to her, during a time when he was being kept at a distance from her by Clara's father. So these 2 allusions are both replaced with new material in the revised version of Brahms's trio. The other major theme in the trio that Brahms replaces is the second theme group of the 1st movement. And this is the material that I have identified as most clearly elusive to a 3rd source. And that 3rd source is Domenico Scarlatti's C major keyboard sonata K159. I'm going to play just a little bit of this. So Brahms is quite familiar with the Scarlatti sonatas. We know that he owned a copy of them in the mid-1850s, and he mentions this repertory several times in his correspondence of that period and later. This allusion appears most clearly in the recapitulation of the trio's 1st movement at the end of the 2nd theme group, where Brahms takes the material from Scarlatti's sonata and he fragments it, beginning here in F sharp major, which interestingly is a tritone away from Scarlatti's key, perhaps connoting a sense of distance, perhaps temporal distance from the score. And I will play this passage as well. So this is the where we hear the clearest resemblance to the Scarlatti, but there are also other thematically related passages throughout the movement, as I discuss in detail in my book. And I also examine there how the allusion resonates with main thematic material in the 2nd and 3rd movements of the trio, but less so in the 4th. So this is a passage from the second movement that I also discuss as being related to the Scarlatti material. And this is a passage from the third movement. And if we look at the opening here, it's mainly the sequence of pitches. So the rhythms have been changed, the note repetitions in the melody have been removed, but the sequence of pitches is very similar. Of course, we're in a different key here. We're in B major, but the relationship, as I'm saying, what I'm saying is that the relationship to the original source is becoming more and more distant with each passing movement. So the character of this movement is obviously quite different, very slow and contemplative. So each successive movement contains thematic material that is less and less closely tied to the Scarlatti theme, as if that theme is somehow gradually receding further into the musical past. And I trace that process in detail in my book. So it appears that the three themes that were replaced in the revised version of the trio were precisely the three that alluded to music of earlier composers. So what does this all mean? It has been proposed at various times by a number of scholars that the song references are Brahms's way of secretly proclaiming his love for Clara Schumann, and that the older Brahms, out of discretion, may have wanted to hide this by removing the allusions in the revised version. The identification of a Scarlatti reference is not in direct conflict with this idea, as the Scarlatti sonatas were actually associated with Clara Schumann's concert career for several decades, starting in the 1830s, when she was among the more consistent performers of these works. She was even singled out for mention by Czerny in the preface to his 1839 edition of the sonatas. However, I am not necessarily a proponent of this idea for a variety of reasons. Certainly, it would have been entirely inappropriate for Brahms to have done such a thing. Robert Schumann was still very much alive when the piece was written. He had not yet even been institutionalized. Clara was pregnant with Robert's child. And Schumann was a revered and highly influential mentor for Brahms. But also the idea that Brahms would try to hide such a message by excising the quotes in the revision seems quite illogical to me. Because first of all, the piece had existed in print with the allusions and had been known in that form for decades. Secondly, by removing these melodies from the original, he risked attracting more attention to those passages than if he had simply left them there. And thirdly, he did not retract the first version and expressed to the publisher little concern as to what would become of it. It's quite possible, and in fact, perhaps safest to assume that the reason for the revisions is largely about musical quality and coherence. Passages such as the second theme group in the original first movement, for example, have often been criticized for their awkwardness and lack of coherence. And Brahms himself expressed dissatisfaction with the musical integrity of the first version. But still, it seems significant, I think, that the removed melodies were precisely those that were illusory. In my book, I proposed another possible meaning for the allusions, arguing that by alluding to Scarlatti, a composer of a bygone era, most clearly in the first movement, and then allowing the Scarlatti theme to resurface in less and less clearly recognizable forms in each successive movement of the trio, it's as if the music of Brahms's predecessor is receding further and further into the distant past as the work progresses. Dovetailing with that process are the song allusions in the last two movements, which speak of lost and distant connections, and in the Beethoven of one person bridging a gap to another by singing that person's songs back to them, just as Brahms plays Scarlatti's tune back to him, along with Schubert and the Schubert and Beethoven melodies. So then the songs might be read as Brahms's attempt to bridge his music back to that of the past, to a lineage and his forebears. So he's illustrating himself drawing on a lineage and yet also becoming gradually more distant from it and more distinct in his own right. In that case, alluding to the Beethoven source by way of Schumann's fantasy could represent Brahms's acknowledgement of the role Schumann played as a conduit through whom Brahms was delivered his musical legacy, by means of Schumann's mentorship and advocacy, including his article Neue Bahnen. By removing all three illusions in the revised version 35 years later, Brahms is perhaps signaling not only further temporal distance from the sources of the past, but also a more mature artistic perspective that stands apart with more creative independence from his musical forebears. So that's a bit of the background and summary of some of my thoughts on the piece, and I will now turn the floor over to Ji Young, who is going to provide some further context and perspectives.
Thank you, Jacquelyn. That was it's such a compliment to what the work that I've been doing, because I'm also interested, well, have been interested in practices of allusion and reference in Brahms's music, but from the other side. So, whereas your work is sort of sees very far in terms of the multi-movement progression, and also in terms of placing history, this kind of long-range view. I've been interested in very local, specific moments, both in terms of the music that I talk about. So I tend to talk about very specific passages within a work, and also how this builds upon Paul Berry's work, how circumstantial forces can converge at a specific moment in time to lend meaning to the allusion. Actually, to be clear, I should say that I'm not talking just about allusions, but also more explicit references like quotations and transcription. I was interested in the two musical gifts that Brahms gave to Clara in the year 1854. So we're talking about around the same time, but after Robert Schumann had been taken to Endenich. And those two musical gifts are the Opus 9 variations on a theme by Robert Schumann, which, as everybody knows, it also harkens back to Clara's variations on the same theme by Robert Schumann. And then there's a kind of prehistory, it's a very layered kind of musical gift. And secondly, a special arrangement that Brahms made of a movement from Robert Schumann's Piano Quintet, Opus 44. This is a scherzo movement. So instead of thinking about allusions to music that is kind of out there in the public sphere by composers who are mostly long dead, I guess my points of references have been living composers who are also protagonists of this very tight-knit group. In this specific case, Robert and Clara Schumann and Brahms, and how these elusive gestures take on expressive charge within their private sphere. Okay, so I would say that both of these two projects, these gifts, Opus 9 and the scherzo arrangement, are kind of outliers in Brahms's early piano writing, and that's something that I'm going to come back to later as we start thinking about instruments and pianism. Okay, so this is the famous quotation at the end of Variation 10 from the Brahms's Opus 9 variations. And this is a quotation that it's nearly verbatim, and Brahms fully embraced and owned up to it. He said to Joachim that in this variation, Clara speaks. And I cannot get into the details of why, but this was a time, so this is like the summer of 1854, when memory and recognition of music and recognition of people was something laden with almost existential value. And that is because Robert Schumann, since going to Endenich, had displayed a strange kind of amnesia or a kind of jumbled sense of reality during that time. And not to mention that Clara was not getting transparent reports about what was going on, what was his condition. So from her perspective, it felt as if he had abandoned her in his thoughts, really, that he was not asking about her or the family. And therefore, this act of remembering and recognizing things was very, very important. And in fact, both Clara and Brahms use this quotation as a almost literal memory test for Robert Schumann. He was goaded. There's a quotation here. Do you know what it is? Where is it from? And at another time, I can talk more about the details of how that transpired. But anyway, the importance is that it was almost literally used as a memory test for Robert Schumann. So that if he did recognize it, then there was a recognition of this shared past history and life that they had together. Okay, so now moving on to this scherzo. So the background for this is Brahms had prepared a four-hand arrangement of the entire piano quintet of Robert Schumann's for Clara's birthday, September 13th, 1854. But he prepared a special joke just for her. And the joke is spelled out in the heading of this autograph page. So he wrote similarly to Joachim in a letter that he had prepared this arrangement of the scherzo movement, few pianoforte, and then Frau Schumann, a line. But what really struck me about it is the trio section. Brahms writes durch innere Stimmen zu ergänzen, which I underlined in red. And it's written in three staves. The melody is in the middle. The outer staves are the kind of accompaniment figure. And I thought that this harkens, in my opinion, this harkens very strongly back to Schumann's Humoresque, Opus 20, and his use of the innere Stimme there, where also there's a kind of melodic core in the middle staff, surrounded by accompaniment figuration. But what's odd is, okay, in the Robert Schumann example, the innere Stimme is, people don't play it. I mean, you can't really play. You would have to restrike notes. It would be very awkward. In the Brahms, he writes durch innere Stimmen zu ergänzen, to be completed. If you know the piece, you know that those innere Stimmen that he's referring to are the canonic reverberations of the melody. So the melody goes and then another voice goes as a kind of echo, and those are to be completed. You cannot. Even Brahms couldn't go so far as to write those notes as well. It's just already too much for two hands. And then, so what's interesting here is that, okay, we're talking about a transcription, so explicit reference to Robert Schumann's music, but there's an allusive gesture, and the allusion is, I say, to the Humoresque, but the allusion is not your typical allusion, right? It's not a melody, a motive, a rhythm, a harmonic motion, but the allusion is to a musical act, an allusion that is to be activated in the act of performance. And actually, to be more precise, is to be activated in the performer's internal processing as this person is performing, because the listener won't hear that you are thinking about these inner Stimmen, since they're not actually performed. So I find that very kind of intriguing type of allusive gesture. So maybe this is a good time for Roger to jump in with his experiences.
Oh, thanks, G, and thanks, Jacquelyn, too. It's so rich, the materials you're presenting here, and it has me thinking, actually, both, I think these lines of interpretation are predicated on this idea that music not only can convey a sort of plenitude of meaning, but also that it's a kind of conveyor of temporality, of kind of a means of traversing time and space through the evocation of memory, bringing the past into the present. So that strikes me as a really productive kind of intersection, but it's also marked, I think, from what you've each said, about some of the tensions that emerge between the private and the public realm. So Jacquelyn, when you mentioned Neue Bahnen, this seems to be a case where private praise goes public in a way that then sort of can easily blow out of control and ends up putting this enormous pressure on Brahms, who at the same time is having to think about publishing his own works and in making this sort of transition between autograph manuscripts designed for kind of private consumption or sharing within a small circle. I think, Jacquelyn, you might have mentioned it before, kind of echo chamber music, I think you called it. This, where everything again is so redolent and so full of potential meaning, and there's such a kind of attunement to what that meaning might be. So then letting it go out into the world at large, where basically you lose control over it. And I think that's something, Jacquelyn, you kind of, when Brahms is indifferent in a sense to the fate of the first one 35 years later, it's partly because he knows it's gone. He can't control it even if he wants to. He might have a Barbra Streisand effect, which, if he tried to really cut out those illusions. So I think there's a really kind of interesting sort of set of differences there, but also I think you're both thinking really creatively about illusions, or about what illusion might do in terms that Paul Berry lays out. So yeah, these ideas that it's something to be activated. It's not simply something to be recognized on paper as a simple correspondence. That's the type of illusion finding, or reminiscence hunting, as they called it then, which Brahms and others had contempt for, right? Just saying, oh look, this is the same pitch sequence. That doesn't have the potential meaning. It's through this activation, and how that works through performance in particular, but also through listening. I mean, Ji Young's point, listening even to what isn't there. This has me thinking of Goethe and his poem Wanderers Nachtlied, where even the silence of the birds means something. There's this kind of, it can be so all-encompassing. So to think about that in relation to the B major trio, in the first version in particular, and what it means to try to get to grips with it on a piano from roughly the same time frame. I mean, I think the first more general point is this idea of, just being in B major, an unusual key, one which almost gives a sort of Chopinesque feel ergonomically, that there's much distribution between white and black keys. In some ways it's comfortable, certainly that opening, the glorious melody. You've got these tolling sort of pastoral fifths, which the Streicher piano, I think, can bring out nicely. It's got a sort of bell-like tone. But it also presents a certain difficulty, which Jacquelyn referred to. I think Brahms himself realized there was an awkwardness about the writing throughout the first version that he was trying to streamline when he made the revisions. And that's perhaps independent of some of the content of those particular, thematic content of those passages. But there is, in a sense, an uncompromising sort of way of writing, which I think you can look across Brahms's early output and find elsewhere in the early sonatas and so on. Another thing which I think is interesting, just generally as a pianistic point, is some of these key relationships. And as Jacquelyn mentioned, the first version is sort of somewhat unruly. It's formally, it's got these interesting kind of extended 3-key expositions and like multi-tempo sections in movements and so on. But there's also a kind of proximity to these key relationships. So for instance, the fact we start in B major, and then the second group is in G sharp minor, so it's a relative minor, and that's itself not so radical. But then we have this third section, which is in E major. So you've got this thing from just G sharp minor to E major just being a single semitonal sort of transformation. And that happens, those 3 key areas are so important throughout the entire work. And of course, the other really important transformational relationship is between B major and B minor, because the piece is so unusual in having all 4 movements in B in one of those keys. So that parallel shift, which again, it's so small, it's only a semitone, it's just a finger's breadth, and yet it can carry so much meaning, especially that parallel shift between B major and B minor. And I think more than anywhere else in the finale, where you have that sort of such a dramatic kind of extinguishing of hope, essentially, from the Andi Geliebte melody to this very kind of brutal close. So you have these harmonic relationships, and then you've also got such a economic use of these specific intervallic motivic materials, which Jacquelyn's presented in light of the Scarlatti sonata as a source, you know, in this simply conjunct scalar motion with the for the Scarlatti reverse. So you've got these very elemental patterns that just keep recurring in all these different configurations, sometimes even at the same place on the piano. So for instance, the opening, when you have the E major tune, you still have this is later in the exposition, you still have the pastoral fifth in the bass, but it's the same pitches specifically that give way to the E major melody. Another example, which I think is interesting there, is the fugato subject, which is one of these things he ditched, and I think probably most people would understand why, because again, it's based on that conjoint ascent, but the way it's presented is so sort of Baroque in the pejorative sense, and the way that material returns in the recapitulation is incredibly knotty, almost to the point of a sort of grosser fuga level of difficulty for performer and listener. What I would say about the striker, and perhaps this would also apply to the graph in this context, is some of those difficulties are alleviated because the texture is a little bit more pellucid. It is possible to hear things, and more generally, I mean, this is a broad point, but I think it's important here. What Ji Young was talking about, individual relationships between hands in a piano trio in that chamber context, the kind of triangulation of possible relationships between piano and cello, piano and violin and cello, lead to these kind of linear connections, you know, whether that's through sort of treble and bass voice leading or accompaniment and melody, which are incredibly flexible within the sound world that the striker affords, because it's very difficult actually on this instrument for the piano to be too loud. And this brings me to one further point, which is there are these numerous kind of sections that might be slightly unkindly characterized as bombastic, where Brahms just sort of lets rip and wants fortissimo, he wants the full force of the instrument, plus the strings too. So I'm thinking here of the coda of the first movement, which is very, very kind of out there, you know, and actually did lead to some criticism from critics who said this is just too much. And this is one of the passages that he excises. Similarly, in the Adagio, there's an allegro section, which is kind of unusual, which gets quite overwrought, and that too gets cut. So the cuts can happen for various reasons, and I would suggest maybe some of them have to do with the notion that this piece might be played on a wider range of pianos, including things like the American Steinway or these kind of concert pianos, as chamber music becomes more of a fixture in public spaces. So that's not to say he never writes thick textures in the later version. In fact, you could argue the second theme in the finale is one such section that is actually much more heavy than the very sort of translucent and beautifully spun out second theme in the first version, the Andi Fenegolita reference. So there are these passages, but I feel in general what the early version has is this sense of a kind of unrestrained, you know, set of demands on the pianist, which will perhaps deliberately lead to rubbing up against the instrument's limits in an almost kind of Beethovenian way. That Brahms isn't scared of that and doesn't actually mind if you are sort of right at the edge there. Whereas I believe for me at least, playing the revised version, it has a very different kind of sensibility, and it doesn't reach that point, which I think you could link, Jacquelyn, to your observations about his growing maturity and sort of sense of perspective on this, that he's no longer sort of feeling the need to prove himself in certain ways. There is perhaps a greater acceptance of not only of his own place, you know, in music history, but of also what other people might make of it, which is out of his hands. So he's not so kind of desperate in a sense. And again, to put it back in the context you mentioned with the first one, where he is writing this, or certainly thinking about publishing it in the wake of Neue Bahnen, where all of those issues about what are people going to think of me after reading this from Schumann are going to be super acute in his mind. So anyway, there's some general observations. Maybe Mike, have you got any?
Yeah, I mean that does seem right what you said, Roger, about the intersection of the textures of the first version. I mean, it seems to me much more extreme, right? You have on the thinner side, you have a more extreme kind of thinner textures with the fugato and so on, and then on the bombastic side, you got extremes there too, and it's just pushing at the limits of whatever piano he had in mind. But I think in general, our current notions of historical instruments, that these earlier, say 1830s Viennese pianos like the Graf, with still more transparent kind of sounds, it lends itself better to kind of being pushed to the limits. And then the later Steinway sound has, it's more about the blend of timbres. So yes, I mean, I think it were one to kind of intersect with instrumental aesthetics, that seems an obvious thing to link. But I just going back also to Jacquelyn's Scarlatti reference, which I find very convincing. I mean, I once you say it, I hear it for sure. I was also wondering, the way it's framed. I mean, in your view, the most crystallized or closest illusion happens in the first movement, and you played a little bit with the example, and the way it is presented in the Brahms has this echo effect. The strings, right? Am I right? The strings first play, and then immediately the piano comes in, and then there's this back and forth, and there's a certain kind of disorientation and kind of echoey effect. And of course, the original Scarlatti itself is referential. I mean, it's sort of fanfare, horns, evokes kind of real world space. So in other words, in addition to, I guess, notions of historical distance, I wonder what your thoughts are about when it actually is in the kind of real world sonic acoustical medium, that he's also playing with these echoes in this way. I mean, actually, for me, even though in terms of the material, the third movement, the opening of the third movement, obviously is drastically remade, as you argue, but one can also think that actually is the most stable presentation of this illusion too.
Yes, that's an excellent observation, Mike. I think one thing we could say about the original Scarlatti theme, you referred to it as being kind of fanfare-like, and I agree that it might kind of be likened to the sound of a post horn, which has potential associations with distance and kind of bridging the distance. But also, yes, I mean, the way it does kind of echo in that original passage in the first movement, you can think of it almost like the reference is sort of echoing across time. And it is very unstable, and it's also harmonically unstable. He modulates several times in that passage. Yes, that's really interesting.
Just one extra thing I was thinking about there. Partly it seems to me, as in the course of performing, that it does announce itself. So it has this kind of meta presentational effect. It's a fanfare saying, "Here's a fanfare," but beyond that, it's also heralding the recapitulation. So there's this makes me think too of Beethoven. The famous example of the horn call, the misplaced horn call at the recap of the Eroica, where it's sort of saying, "Hey, the recap's coming," but it is the recap at the same time. So there's this kind of blending of form and function there, which I think is kind of interesting, because there is a point. I think it feels like a relief almost when it comes in, because it's freeing us from the fugato. There's a sense in which we've got all kind of tied up in that, and then suddenly the cavalry come charging over the hill, and there's some hope.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in terms of listening experience, it clarifies. I mean, it helps lend a kind of formal functional clarification that we're out of that, and then it's transitional in nature to it's retransition is in process and does that job.
That moment is, it emerges back into major at that moment as well.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of relief or a sort of transcendent quality in that regard also.
The other thing I was curious about, Jacquelyn, I mean, and you do talk about this in your article and book, is, and we had alluded to it, is this tragic archetype. I mean, there are very few pieces in the 19th century that begin in the major and then end in its own minor. I mean, it's in my own kind of sense, it's this suicidal topic, and I mean, a couple of things come into mind. Obviously, Schubert E-flat Impromptu, Brahms 119 number 4. There's a Chopin Nocturne in B, actually, that does that, with this kind of recitative emerge. How does that fold into your vision of this work?
Well, I guess to me, it sort of signals something of the feeling of maybe the impossibility of the task that Brahms feels that he's faced with at the time, or the futility, or at least the extraordinary challenge of the idea of sort of picking up where Beethoven left off, or even where his predecessors more generally have left off. I don't know.
I mean, the piece sort of ends in the different place than we were promised, right? I mean, and especially with the Undefended, I mean, it's such an uplifting thing you strive for. But, with all these quotations, of course, he never closes them. I mean, the Schumann thing is so beautiful, right, in part because it serves closure and more closure, and how much more can you say I love you with this kind of closing gesture. Whereas in the Brahms, I mean, all of these illusions, they're cadentially, they're just left open, and then the only closing thing you get finally is this death nail in its own minor.
So ultimately, I mean, there's a degree to which, if he is trying to bridge a gap, there's ultimately a degree to which that gap can't be bridged.
Yeah, this tragic final movement, the way you're interpreted, it almost seems to prefigure the reception of Ravel's La Valse, this kind of mad waltz, where your sense of history and sense of hope or optimism for the future is somehow curtailed, or don't see hope beyond.
I thought that aspect came across still more in Miriam and Clancy's performance of the later version, in the finale, where I mean, I felt like, whoa, I mean,
like whirling
La Valse moment.
I suppose there is the question, though, of what is being negated or destroyed there, and that's where the fact he has replaced the illusion with a theme of his own devising, presumably that theme, that suffers the fate, So the question is, I guess I hear it slightly differently insofar as there's confidence there, perhaps almost too much, maybe hubris to an extent, which gets punished. Whereas in the first version, the fact it is the Beethoven reference that suffers the fate, it's more ambiguous, I think, because I think your interpretation, Jacquelyn, is compelling, that it's kind of saying, how can I actually really follow Beethoven? Like there's that sort of reading, but which is complicated even further if you refract it through Schumann. But there's also perhaps just a different kind of affective element to that too. That there's something, I must say, I find it's kind of shattering to play the very last bars of the original version, where you have that. of such an interesting cadence, because again, it's just that from G major, that semitonal shift, and there's not really a proper cadence there, you know, there's not a 5/1, it's just brute force. So it's interesting how the same material can be made to mean, you know, sometimes subtly, sometimes drastically different things through the context it's put in. And I think this goes to the larger point. In some ways, one of the most incredible things about the piece in both its versions is how Brahms in the revision manages to make it seem as if it was always meant to be that way. Like there's such a degree of craft in assembling a structure and a whole set of thematic sort of connections, you know, internally that seem completely tight, that don't feel as if they've been revised. And so there's this kind of, not, again, it goes back to your point, Jacquelyn, about not erasing the earlier version, but somehow just showing it can also be different. And we have to kind of reckon with both, with the simultaneity at the same time as the kind of impossibility of the two existing.
I mean, I gotta say, I think in the finale of the first version, I mean, if we're talking about sort of the act of negating in the final pages or couple of pages, I mean, to negate the Andy Fenner reference is more interesting than negating the ba 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 ba. I mean, for me, that is a slight weak point of the revised version. I don't know. It's just that theme. I don't know. I don't look forward to that too much. My old teacher, who shall remain nameless, but if he sees this, you'll know who he is. He says that's the American football anthem. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, and Clara Schumann didn't appreciate that change, did she either? I think she complained about it to Brahms, without making it too obvious if she recognized the first version as an illusion. So it's, again, a kind of gray area. But as opposed to the first movement, Mike, I mean, I totally agree. But where the first movement coda is so delicate and just beautifully, I mean, it feels so inevitable and yet so surprising and special as a coda.
Yeah.
They're quite different, aren't they, in terms of how the revision inflects the original. I think we could probably keep talking about this for a long time, but I notice we have been talking for about an hour, so maybe it's time to bring things to a close. And I'll just thank Mike, Ji Young, and especially Jacquelyn for being here and engaging in such a stimulating discussion. It's been really fun to talk Brahms with you all.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Jacquelyn.
Thank you so much for having me.